In 337 AD, the last year of his life, Constantine himself became a Christian, and less than 50 years later, the Romans came under severe pressure on the continent of Europe and began to withdraw their legions from the north and the west of Britain. They left the British Isles altogether in 410 AD. The main groupings of the tribes now located in the British Isles were the Celts, who had been pushed into the south and west, the Picts, who were the original inhabitants of the very north of mainland Britain, and who had begun to move southwards after the Romans abandoned the Antonine Wall, the Scots, who were of course originally Israelites who had moved to Ireland and had by now begun to move to the west of Scotland, and the later groups of Hebrews, and the Romans, who for 400 years had integrated in their communities, intermingled, intermarried, and largely reconciled themselves to each other, and had built their own relatively stable communities in the rest of mainland Britain. But when the Roman legions left, there was a massive hole created in the defense capability of that part of these islands. The chaos that followed led to several hundred years of the bloodiest that these islands have ever seen. Not for the first time, and certainly not for the last, would this narrow stretch of sea channel between the island of Britain and the continent take on a strategic importance of enormous significance. The solution for the leaders of the tribes, particularly in the southeast, the part nearest the continent, was to invite friends from other Israelite tribes who had settled in what are now the nearby Scandinavian countries to come and settle here and help defend these shores. The Vikings in Denmark, or Danmark. One of these Viking tribes were the Angles, who in due course would give their name to the whole of England. The British Isles were known throughout Europe for their riches, and now it was open house for anybody who wanted to plunder them. The Celts came round from Ireland. The Vikings, although originally invited as friends, spread the word back in their own lands that this was a very inviting country, and other not-so-friendly Vikings seized the opportunity to make what they could. Gone was the relative order and tranquility of the Roman administration. It was chaos. Law and order was non-existent, and it would take centuries for it to be restored with a completely new system of government, learned, developed, and paid for by the experience and bloodshed of those intervening centuries. The Vikings brought yet more gods. Christianity was fighting for its very existence. It's worth reminding ourselves at this point that, like Scotland and Wales, the Romans never conquered Ireland, and the Irish culture and church remained even more unpolluted because of the strip of sea that acted in the same way as the English Channel prevented the mainland of Europe from invading the south coast of Great Britain. It's now early in the 5th century AD, and our story turns to one particular young Christian, although it has been suggested that there may well have been more than one flesh and blood human being who gave rise to the legends behind the patron saint of Ireland, St. Patrick. In the northeast of the island of Ireland, just outside the town of Ballymena, is the very distinctive shape of Slemish Mountain. It's said that young Patrick was captured and taken as a slave to Ireland in his teenage years. And behind me now are the slopes of Slemish Mountain, where St. Patrick tended the sheep during his captivity. Patrick was descended from the Romans and was the son of a Christian minister. He was captured and taken as a slave boy to Ireland at the age of 15, but escaped after 6 years in captivity, and when he returned to Britain, he spent some years studying Christian teaching. because, as he claimed in later letters, he felt he had been called to go back to Ireland to convert them to Christianity. Although he wasn't the first Christian minister in Ireland, he was appointed to be the first Bishop of Armagh, and after a distinguished ministry, he was buried in the place that is now called Downpatrick. At a time when Christianity was by no means secure on the mainland of Britain, the island of Ireland became a sanctuary for the original doctrines of the Celtic Church brought to these shores by Joseph of Arimathea, until such time as they could be taken back safely to the mainland. And St. Patrick was one of 3 patron saints of Ireland to perform this custodianship over the course of nearly 200 years. The other 2 were St. Bridget, a nun who is said to have founded many monasteries, including one here in Kildare, and to have performed many miracles. And the other was a man called Columbkille, or Columba, and we'll turn our attention to his contribution in a moment. Patrick is thought to have begun his ministry in around 430 AD and died in about 493. Bridget would have known Patrick. She was born in 451 AD and died in 525. Columba came a little later, born in 521. This is a typical Celtic stone, and this one is in Glen Columbkille, Columba's valley here in Donegal. This is as far west as Columba came. Behind me is the Atlantic Ocean, which stretches away to Canada and the United States of America. Over there is the village and the monastery that he founded. And this is the man who made it all happen, St. Columba, or Columbkille, on the banks of Loch Garten, where he was born into a local royal family. But Columba became a monk, and at the age of about 20, he went to study at Clonard Monastery in County Meath. And he proved to be a very adept student. 5 years later, in order to escape the pestilence which had broken out in the monastery, he returned to Ulster, and over the next 15 years he was instrumental in setting up further monasteries in Down, Donegal, Londonderry, Offaly and Meath. Columba is said to have been a very tall, powerfully built, athletic and charismatic man. A very strong and striking character, with a loud, melodious voice that could be heard from one hilltop to another. Very useful when finding your way amongst these hills. Columba certainly got about a bit. This is the road westwards from Loch Garten. Imagine walking this route as Columbkille would have done, except that he wouldn't have had the road to help him in the best and the worst of Irish weather. We're on our way from Loch Garten to Glen Columbkille, one of the westernmost points of the island of Ireland, where Columbkille founded one of his many Christian settlements. Now, in those days, the only means of getting your own prayer book was to copy someone else's, and this is exactly what Columba did whilst working in County Down at Movila Abbey. The problem was that the owner of the Psalter didn't agree with Columba's view that Columba himself had every right to keep what he had copied. When judgment was given about who the new Psalter should belong to, it was King Dermot who ruled that it should belong to the owner of the original. Dermot was a local king who had declared himself to be the king of all Ireland and had himself crowned in a pagan ceremony here at Tara. By now, of course, the coronation stone had been taken to Scotland. As a Christian, Columbkille or Columba fundamentally disagreed with the authenticity of this coronation, as well as with the ruling about the Psalter. In due course, the feelings between these two very strong characters got so out of hand that eventually they both mobilized their own armies. And they met in battle finally, here underneath the mountain of Ben Bulben on the west coast of Ireland at the Battle of Coldrevney. It's said that at the end of the day there were 3,000 casualties at the foot of this mountain, all of them Dermot's army. The problem for Columba at the end of the battle was that the monastic authorities did not take at all kindly to this military activity, and he was threatened with excommunication. Columba himself felt much remorse and responsibility for the slaughter, and with other Christian monks interceding on his behalf, the sentence was commuted to exile. Columba came here to Devonish Island, where a well-established Christian community had been set up many years before by a monk who was now a venerable and wise old sage called Mollais. And it's difficult to imagine more placid and serene surroundings conducive to wrestling with such a problem as was confronting these two considerable men. The decision they reached was that Columba would move to Scotland, and in due course he set out on the treacherous journey from Merlo Bay here on the north coast of Antrim, a trip which turned out to be some 60 miles to the island of Iona, celebrated by this Iona song, sung in Gaelic, Safely Ashore. here I'm standing where Columba landed some 1500 years ago. This is Columba Bay on the island of Iona, where the teachings of the original Celtic church brought to Ireland by Patrick were finally brought back to the mainland. And over there is Ireland, and Merlot Bay, where they set sail. Columba remained based in Iona for over 30 years until his death in 597, but he travelled extensively, especially on the mainland of Alba, Scotland. Even at this stage, Druids were still active and intent on driving out this new religion, and it's said that not long after establishing the monastery on Iona, Columba was on his way to Inverness when he was stopped by a group of Druid priests who demanded that he and his 12 monks return to Ireland. These pagan priests claimed that Druidism was the true religion, and drew a circle on the ground, claiming that Christ conflicted with the nature cycle. Columba took his staff and drew an intersecting cross within the circle, claiming that God could not conflict with nature because God had himself created nature, and indeed complemented it. And that further reconciliation between the pagan circle and the Christian cross that was begun by Constantine can be seen on a number of the crucifixes throughout the Celtic lands of those centuries. Even in those days, Iona had an international reputation. Both the monastery and the nunnery were thriving communities, and over the years it became a very popular place to be buried. There are 10 kings and queens of royal families, not just from Scotland, but throughout much of Scandinavia, whose graves are on Iona, one of whom is said to be Macbeth. One has to ask, if there's nothing behind all these traditions, why did so many kings insist on being buried here? Before we leave Iona, here's Columba's prayer. Be a bright flame before me, O God. Be a guiding star above me, a smooth path below me, a kindly shepherd behind me, today, tonight, and forever. Alone, with none but you, my God, I journey on my way. What need I fear when you are near, O Lord of night and day? More safe am I within your hand than if a crowd did round me stand. Columba died on the 9th of June 597, with his head resting on the stone of destiny by then being kept at the high altar in the custody of the monastery he founded in Iona. By retaining and restoring the links with the original Glastonbury church, the legacy left by this devout and charismatic man has been immense.